welcome to our program today, Understanding Violence Against Muslim Minorities in Indonesia. This talk explores why violence against Indonesia's Muslim minority sects, specifically the Ahmadiyya sect and the Shia sect, unexpectedly emerged and escalated over the past 2 decades, demonstrating how the occupation of public space by Muslim minorities were perceived as a challenge to Sunni Muslim dominance, and how decentralization reforms incentivized political actors to engage in conflict. This talk identifies factors driving Indonesia's shift towards illiberalism. In doing so, it speaks to broader concerns about the state of democracy in the world today. Our speaker today is Dr. Jessica Sudirgo, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Asian Studies program at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service, the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, and the Berkeley Center at Georgetown University. She holds a PhD in political science from the University of Toronto, and her research is motivated by an interest in ethnic and religious conflict, with a regional focus on Southeast Asia. Welcome, Professor.
Well, and thank you so much for allowing me to talk to you about my research. And thank you to the audience for showing up and making the time. I really appreciate it. So let me actually begin by setting up this talk a little bit. So this is my current book project. Like Dr. Esposito said, I'm working on this book during my postdoc here at Georgetown. And the talk will focus particularly on the empirics of the book, though I do go through my theoretical argument a little bit as well. So as Dr. Esposito said, and the title of my talk suggests, I'll be talking about repression and violence against Muslim minority sects in Indonesia. Of course, Indonesia is the country with the largest Muslim population in the world, but the overwhelming majority of Muslims are Sunni. And so what I'll be doing is focusing on the experiences of a heterodox Muslim sect known as the Ahmadiyya. We'll also talk briefly about the experience of Indonesia's Shia community at the very end of the presentation. So I actually want to begin this presentation by recounting the episode of violence that really was my entry point into this project. What actually made me want to actually write a book on this. And this episode of violence occurred on February 6, 2011, in a village in Indonesia called Cikesik, located on the western shore of the island of Java. So on this day, like many other Fridays, men gathered at the village mosque for afternoon prayers. But unlike the Fridays before and those since, the men did not return to work or go home after prayers were over. Instead, they, about 1,500 of them, marched over to the local office of the Ahmadiyya. So armed with machetes and other makeshift weaponry, the men surrounded the building and angrily demanded that the Ahmadis stop spreading their heretical beliefs. When the Ahmadis tried to escape, the mob caught them, forced them to strip naked, and beat them. 6 Ahmadis were injured, 3 more were beaten to death, their bodies mutilated and desecrated by the mob. So the brutality of the violence in Cikesik, seen in grainy cell phone footage that went viral, was highly disturbing, but it wasn't the first nor the last episode of violence where members of the Ahmadiyya sect were targeted by their Sunni neighbors and members of Muslim hardliner groups. As you'll see on this events map, which I'll show now, you'll see that beginning in 2005, Ahmadis in Indonesia were targets of high levels of mobilization and repression. The red dots on this map represent instances of mobilization, such as attacks on homes, schools, and mosques, and the blue polygons represent legal restrictions on the sect. So this phenomenon of violence and repression against the Ahmadiyya community was really quite puzzling to me, and it was puzzling for a number of reasons. So first, the Ahmadiyya sort of were a new political target, at least at the national or even regional level. So even in 2004, just a year before the conflict started escalating, if you had asked your ordinary everyday Indonesian who the Ahmadiyya were, most of them wouldn't No. And in fact, the only national newspaper coverage that I could find about the Ahmadiyya, before 2005 was this article published in 1974, pictured here from Tempo News magazine. And the whole point of the article is that this group is completely unknown. And the title of the article was actually Ahmadiyya, a matter that has been forgotten. So it was, why in 2005 did this so-called forgotten group suddenly become sort of this national concern? Second, unlike many Muslim majority countries in the world where sectarian divides have been longstanding, religious conflict in Indonesia historically has occurred along Christian Muslim lines. In fact, less than 5 years before anti-Ahmadiyya mobilization really emerged, Christian Muslim violence was taking place in a number of regions in Indonesia. So, given these pre existing religious cleavages, what prompted this conflict between different Muslim sects to actually emerge? And finally, and this is really the puzzle at the center of my book project, is why the Ahmadiyya were considered threatening at all. So, like the Quakers in the US, Ahmadis adhere to a pacifist ideology and so have never posed a security threat to any other group. They're not economically privileged in any way. And they're also very, very small in terms of population size. So they only make up 0.17% of the entire Indonesian population. And so due to their size, they really don't pose a political threat. So I'm certainly not the first person to puzzle over the targeting of Muslim minorities in Indonesia. And there's actually been a lot of really interesting work on the topic. But I was never really fully satisfied by these explanations. So most of the explanations really focus either on ideas or elite machinations. So scholars who focus on ideas see the conflict involving the Ahmadiyya as being driven by anger about these so-called blasphemous beliefs that Ahmadis adhere to. But Ahmadis have been holding these so-called blasphemous ideas since their founding. And so ideational explanations really can't explain why violence and repression have occurred at some times and in some places, but not in others. Other scholars have tried to explain the conflict by pointing to the behavior of political elites and the institutional structures that push elites to use the Ahmadiyya threat for their own interests. And certainly these elite-centric approaches are better at explaining variation, and I do use a lot of them in my explanation, as you'll see. But they don't really get to the question of threat resonance. So, why would people actually buy the rhetoric that the Ahmadiyya are threatening to them? Why would they actually waste their time and energy to fighting against this very, very tiny group? And so in the book, I really try to understand both of these dimensions. And in doing so, I ask two questions. So the first is, given their political and economic insignificance, why were the Ahmadiyya considered threatening? And second, why did anti-Ahmadiyya activity escalate in 2005? And what explains geographic variation in the occurrence of conflict during this time? So why, during this period, were some communities, left alone while others were very much targeted? And so, in the presentation, I'll tackle obviously the first question first and the second question after that. But before I do so, let me talk a little bit about my data. So I collected 3 types of data to answer this question. So I wanted to really get a sense of the temporal and spatial trends of the conflict. And to figure this out, I constructed an events database, which is the data that I used to make the animated map that I showed earlier in this presentation. I used events data from Religious Freedom NGO reports, as well as newspaper articles from 4 national newspapers in Indonesia, Kompas, Tempo, as well as the Jakarta Post and Jakarta Globe. I also conducted in-depth semi-structured interviews. I conducted over 135 interviews, mostly in Bahasa Indonesia, with religious minorities, politicians, bureaucrats, and perpetrators of violence, many of whom were members of Islamic hardliner groups. I carried out these interviews in Jakarta, Bandung, Tasikmalaya, Surabaya, and Medan. And I chose these sites really as part of a nested paired comparison strategy, where I compared 2 cases at the district level, Bandung and Tasikmalaya, and 2 at the provincial level, so East Java and North Sumatra. And in each of these pairs, there was one, case where there was high levels of repression and violence, and the second one where the Ahmadiyya community were left alone. And I also did interviews for my Shia case in Madura, Bangil, and Bandung, and I'll talk about that very briefly at the end of the presentation. And finally, I also did archival work at Ahmadiyya headquarters in Bogor to really help me reconstruct village level histories. And I spent 17 months in the field in 2013, 2014, and 2015. So let me begin by asking and answering the first question, which is why the threat of the Ahmadiyya was credible and believable. And I argue that the threat of the Ahmadiyya were credible if they challenged core tenets of belonging to the majority group through the marking of public space. And I call this a visible constitutive threat. And I know this is jargony, but I'm going to really try to walk you through this in a way that's hopefully clear. So to understand what I mean by constitutive threat, I have to sort of begin with my premises, and I begin with the premise that groups are socially constructed and that all groups are produced and reproduced by a set of institutions and practices. So I'll make this very concrete. So to be Catholic is not just to believe in Catholic ideology, but to belong to a church, to attend mass, and to partake in communion. So Catholics as a category are produced by these institutions like the church and practices like confession. And if you got rid of these things, it would really be hard to figure out who is Catholic and also to sustain the group, like the category of Catholic, throughout time. So because the continuity of a group is reliant on these everyday institutions and practices, anything that undermines these core elements of group production is seen as an attack on the group itself. So to extend the example of Catholicism, a ban on communion by the government could be seen as a challenge to Catholics, and even so much as a threat to the existence of Catholics as a group, because it's such a core practice of the group itself. So constitutive threats are essentially those that challenge these foundational criteria for group belonging, and as such, constitutive threats are essentially existential ones. So the Ahmadiyya have long posed a constitutive threat to the category of Muslim, and they challenge a number of foundational tenets of Orthodox Islam. But the biggest constitutive challenge has to do with the founder of the Ahmadiyya sect, a man named Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. And Ahmad, who you see pictured here, considers himself to be a prophet. And this claim really lies in opposition to a core tenet of mainstream Islam, that the Prophet Muhammad is the final prophet and there can be none after him. So for most Muslims, it's impossible to be Muslim and to simultaneously believe that Muhammad is not the last prophet. And this point was clearly communicated to me by a political strategist from the United Development Party, who said, Ahmadiyya differ from us from the perspective of theology and other more important issues. The PPP absolutely supports a ban of that movement unless they declare themselves a new religion. If they did that, there wouldn't be a problem. Ahmadiyya would be able to worship, to associate, to gather, but they shouldn't do it under the name of Islam. So even though the Ahmadiyya don't pose a security or material threat to Sunni Muslims in Indonesia, the threat they do pose is constitutive, and mobilization and repression can be used to address these constitutive threats because they clearly demarcate who belongs and who doesn't. So in this way, I agree with scholars like Abazarai and Seidel, who argue that threats to group boundaries, which are again existential threats, are key drivers of ethnic violence. But what I found in my field work was that the constitutive threat of the Ahmadiyya were only credible or believable when they were publicly visible. So put more concretely, the threat of Ahmadiyya communities was only believable when they engaged in what I call space claiming activities, such as acts of public proselytization, when they staged public religious ceremonies, and when they built these clearly identifiable mosques and schools. These acts were seen as visible challenges to the core tenets of the Muslim category. So the public visibility of constitutive threats matter because it makes sort of threats concrete and embodied and very experiential. You can't really ignore it anymore. And second, public space is imbued by power relations. So think about who controls public space. Disruptions to public space then can therefore be seen as a challenge to the status quo. So because the threat of the Ahmadiyya was only sort of concrete or resonant when they were publicly visible, you really only had mobilization or repression when these minorities did engage in space claiming activity. And it was only in those times and in those places when action was sort of seen as necessary. So for example, in one of my field sites, Bandung, the Ahmadiyya community there was only really publicly visible during the 1960s and 70s. And during this time, they did engage in sort of active public proselytization. And it was really only during this time that their Sunni neighbors opposed the group. Outside of this time period, Bandung's Ahmadiyya community was largely left alone. In contrast, the Ahmadiyya in Tasikmalaya were consistently engaged in space claiming activities from the moment the group established themselves in 1934 to about 2013. And they experienced a lot of opposition, with levels particularly high during the building of new mosques, but also when they had these group meetings, which is what you see on the slide here. So public visibility really shaped whether or not conflict against these Muslim minorities emerged. And I argue that it's really this aspect of visibility that explains variation, not just in the geographic spread of conflict, but also in the scale of conflict. So as I discussed in the beginning of the presentation, and this is illustrated in this graph right here, in 2005, anti-Ahmadiyya conflict really became seen as these like national and regional concerns. But actually, when I reconstructed these village level histories, I quickly realized that anti-Ahmadiyya conflict did occur prior to 2005, but they were very highly localized, only involving sort of village neighbors and local police occasionally. And this made sense to me because only those in close proximity to the space claiming activities of particular Ahmadiyya communities were threatened by them, and thus only a small number of people would act to stop the building of a new mosque or the stopping of a religious celebration. In 2005, however, the constitutive threat of the Ahmadiyya communities across Indonesia became to be seen and experienced by a wider range of people. And this new visibility prompted a wider range of Muslim actors to be fearful of the threat that the Ahmadis posed to sort of Muslim group boundaries. And so as more people were exposed to the threat, more people acted against the group, and rates of anti-Ahmadiyya mobilization and repression multiplied. So why do you see this general upsurge of anti-Ahmadiyya activity beginning in 2005? What led to the sudden visibility of Ahmadiyya communities at the regional or even national level? And so the simple answer to this is political entrepreneurs, which are actors who use these political issues to fulfill their own political and economic interests. So in the Indonesian case, these political entrepreneurs mainly consisted of politicians, first at the district level and then the provincial level, as well as conservative hardliner groups such as the infamous Islamic Defenders Front, the FPI. So politicians used the Ahmadiyya threat to win political office, and conservative hardliner groups used it to access patronage in terms of vote buying, but also positions in the bureaucracy. So the decision of these political entrepreneurs to really upscale was driven by institutional changes that incentivized this behavior. So prior to 2005, and I'll go back here, institutions were arranged in such a way that did not incentivize the use of the Ahmadiyya threat for political means. So during the authoritarian period, politicians did not need to listen to local concerns. And really because of the small size of Ahmadiyya communities, the concerns about Ahmadiyya threats was really always a local concern. And so because they didn't really need to listen to local concerns, they didn't have to sort of bother with this. Interestingly, even with Indonesia's transition to democracy in 1998, local constituencies still didn't really matter much in elections. And so politicians didn't really think about using the Ahmadiyya threat. And so because there were no incentives for amplification before 2005, any conflict involving the Ahmadiyya was isolated at the local level. And you didn't have all of these additional actors really piling on and trying to intervene and exacerbating these really local conflicts. So the institutional incentive structure really changes in 2005. So as part of Indonesia's transition to democracy, the government embarked on this massive decentralization project. They shifted quite a number of responsibilities as well as resources to district governments in order to bring the state closer to the people and theoretically be more accountable to citizens. So decentralization unfolded in basically two steps. So the first step occurred in 1999, where the government devolved fiscal resources to the district level. And in 2004, elections were introduced at the level of the district, the municipality, as well as the province. And these direct elections, although they were introduced in 2004, really began in 2005, taking place on a rolling basis for the initial few years. So these two changes really made it attractive to exploit the Ahmadiyya threat. So the devolution of fiscal resources to the district level in 1999 meant that district and municipal budgets ballooned, which gave elective officials sort of new incentives to win political office. But it also gave, due to all of this money, clients or ordinary citizens also had the opportunities to engage in these increased patron-client relationships to get jobs or to get money for vote buying. So due to the introduction of direct elections, which happens again in 2004 and then begins in 2005, politicians suddenly needed to actually listen to local constituencies. They needed to get the votes of these local constituencies in order to win political office. And so due to this history of local contention involving the Ahmadiyya, the group really became this, very ripe target for instrumentalization or for sort of the use of elites to engage in. So politicians really began to campaign against the Ahmadiyya, and a lot of them also began to pass sort of these draconian laws that severely limited the ability of Ahmadis to engage in religious practices. And this was their way of sort of showing that they were against the Ahmadiyya and for Islam. So in addition to the politicians exploiting the Ahmadiyya threat, hardliner groups like the FPI also did so. The new decentralized environment meant that if you could be of value to politicians, you're able to campaign for them, deliver local votes to them, you could get access to patronage, including jobs. And while there are many ways to deliver political value, I think mobilization and protesting, particularly the space claiming activities of the Ahmadis, was a way for the groups to really display the size of their constituency and also to signal and prove their mobilizational capacity, which politicians really needed. And so essentially what you had was these eruptions of localized episodes of state repression and localized mobilization against Ahmadiyya communities. And these repeated frequent acts of repression and mobilization really shone a spotlight on the visible constitutive threat of the Ahmadiyya. And this really came across in an interview that I had with a member of the FPI who had really been involved in a lot of anti-Ahmadiyya protests really around West Java. And I had asked him, when did you start acting on the Ahmadiyya issue? And he said, in 2006, I think. We knew the Ahmadiyya were there for a long time, but they didn't really have an impact in terms of their growth and their mission. So we didn't really care. But they started to be aggressive, going to influential leaders, proselytizing, so we reacted. So records of Ahmadiyya activity during the early democratic era show that the community didn't really change their behavior and the group wasn't growing beyond birth rates. But this FPI's leaders' perception that the group was more aggressive suggests, how much this increased amplification of the Ahmadiyya threat, this increased visibility of the Ahmadiyya threat really worked, really shows how important political entrepreneurs were to this process. Still, even with the incentives introduced by decentralization, the ability to use the Ahmadiyya threat remained contingent on levels of public visibility. So I want to mention that the case of the Ahmadiyya in Bandung, who are largely left alone, like I said earlier, outside of the 1960s and 1970s. So in the period between 2005 and onwards, you did have the hardliner groups really try in Bandung, try to instrumentalize the threat for their own gain. So they, for example, staged 2 protests against the sect. But the threat didn't really resonate, and it didn't really help them in any way politically. And as such, the threat of the they eventually moved on to other political topics, specifically the Shia, who were more visible. But the reason why the threat of the Ahmadiyya really wasn't credible in Bandung was because the group was a lot more inward oriented during this time. You can see this picture here where they used tarps to cover up any kind of activity that during this annual meeting that they had. In contrast, politicians and hardliner groups in Tasikmalaya were successful in instrumentalizing the Ahmadi threat for their own interests because Ahmadiyya communities in Tasikmalaya were actively engaged in space claiming, at least until 2013. The visibility of Tasikmalaya's Ahmadiyya community meant that the threat was credible and seen as worthy of action. It is interesting to note that in 2013, things began to change in Tasikmalaya, as well as Indonesia more broadly at the national level. As the graph indicates, the incidence of anti-Ahmadiyya conflict in Indonesia has declined in recent years. And I think evidence from my high incidence case, Tasikmalaya, suggests that the targeting of the Ahmadiyya declined for two reasons. The first is that hardliner groups no longer really had a reason to mobilize against the Ahmadiyya because they were successful in their mission to gain access to patronage. They had shown and proved their political value, and so no longer had to keep signaling to politicians that they were politically valuable. And additionally, the political utility of the Ahmadiyya threat also decreased once the group was no longer visible. So after 2013, the community, began to remove symbols and signage from public spaces. And they also, an interviewee told me how they shifted to more relational strategies when proselytizing. And so a Sunni villager told me in 2014, his Ahmadis were not as frontal as before. So by reducing their visibility, the Ahmadiyya threat became less credible. And even though there were politicians in Tasikmalaya that sort of tried to campaign on the threat after this, during this period, they quickly sort of moved on to other kinds of political rhetoric. So, I had missed a slide, but I had asked sort of in this presentation, why the Ahmadiyya became a threat or seen as a threat, and why this threat was seen as credible, and also sort of the spatial and temporal trends of this conflict. And I'd argued that the Ahmadiyya were seen as threats because they were seen as challenging these core foundations of what it meant to be Muslim. And this threat was credible in places and in times where they engaged in space claiming activity. And I had argued that the sudden upsurge of conflict in 2005 is attributable to actions of politicians and hardliner groups that were making the threat visible to a larger audience, and that this upscaling or this process of amplification was incentivized by decentralization reforms. So I'd want to really bring in the Shia case here as promised, because I think it provides an interesting contrast to the experience of the Ahmadiyya in Indonesia, and I think really pinpoints the importance of visibility in explaining sort of processes of threat perception. So anti-Shia conflict in Indonesia did occur, but not even close to the scale of conflict involving the Ahmadiyya. So this figure shows that even at its highest peak, the frequency of anti-Shia incidents was lower than the frequency of anti-Ahmadiyya incidents in Indonesia. And the group never really became sort of this national level target. And in all honesty, I was really confused by this because in many ways you would expect the Shia to be seen as more dangerous. So yes, they are really small, less than 1% of the national population, but they are larger than the Ahmadiyya. Furthermore, the Sunni Shia divide has been a cleavage that has defined violence in other parts of the world. In another reason why you would expect it to be seen as more threatening is that in 2014, the leader of the largest Shia organization in the country actually ran and won a seat in the legislature. So there was sort of this electoral threat. And actually, there were strong efforts by hardliner groups to sort of instrumentalize the threat. As you can see on the slide, this is a poster of an anti-Shia rally that I attended. And so why didn't anti-Shia conflict not take off to the same degree in Indonesia? And this is what And so again, my argument is visibility. So Shia communities in Indonesia are strong adherents of taqiyya, which is the practice of dissimulation to protect oneself from persecution. In Sunni dominated areas, Shia Muslims generally will not carry out their distinct practices and instead carry out Sunni practices of worship, especially when they are in public. And taqiyya is not just practiced by individuals, but also institutions. Most institutions are reluctant to identify themselves as Shia openly. So the practice of taqiyya means that in most communities, the Shia do not pose a visible constitutive threat and thus are not targets of mobilization and state repression nearly to the same degree. And when conflict does occur, and of course it has, they occur in the rare place where the Shia leader does not believe in the practice of taqiyya, such as the case of violence in Madura. So because generally the Shia are not as visible, at least not as visible compared to the Ahmadiyya, the threat of the Shia, is not credible and thus not politically useful for entrepreneurs. And so looking at visibility between these two groups shows that it's an important dimension, like I said, of threat perception. So that I think is really the key takeaway of my findings. So a common question that you usually get in political science is the question of generalizability. So why does this matter? Like if we're looking at this very, very tiny group, why, like what can we learn from that? And I think what I'm trying to make an argument for is we have to reconsider why we think, minorities are threatening. We often assume that minorities are threatening because they pose some kind of economic or political or security threat. But if such a small group can be seen as threatening simply due to the way they claim public space, I argue that visibility really shapes understandings of group threat. And I think what this suggests is that conflict is heavily shaped by elements such as representation in politics and media, the celebration of festivals and ceremonies, and the everyday ways that minorities mark public space through signage, religious institutions, and even dress. And so I think we really need to pay attention to these factors. And in fact, without exploring some symbolic politics and visibility, it's really hard to explain participation in anti-minority mobilization around the world. Like why the people in Switzerland invested resources into these seemingly trivial issues of banning minarets when there were only 4 minarets in Switzerland, why it was seen as this important thing. But if we think about minarets as being a visible challenge to the Judeo-Christian core of Swiss national identity, then I think we can begin to understand these kinds of movements. And so what I really think this project speaks to is to really encourage us to think about the question of pluralism and what really leads to this shift towards illiberalism that we're seeing sort of happening, unfortunately, around the world. So I think I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much. That was very helpful in terms of understanding the situation. We'll turn now for reflections and response to Dr. Yuki Tajima.
First of all, thank you, Jessica. This is an excellent project, and I'm really looking forward to your book manuscript to finally come out in hopefully short order. And thank you also to Dr. Esposito for hosting this excellent event. I think this is a really timely topic these days, and I think that's being reflected in the large number of attendees today. One of the biggest questions out there right now is what is going to be the fate of sort of the liberal democratic practice of democracy, right? So how do we sort of maintain sort of a commitment to pluralism, both in countries in the West, but also in other parts of the world. And so one of the sort of big picture questions that I had for you, Jessica, is when we're looking at the case of Indonesia versus, let's say, in the West, right? Indonesia is decidedly much more communitarian, right? Where the notion of private space is more limited than in the West, where whatever, at least to a greater degree, in the U.S., how you practice your religion is seen as your own business, whereas in Indonesia, this may be less so, right? And what it seems that you're saying is that there's a possibility here that the West, even despite its sort of longstanding tradition of pluralism, at least in many parts of the West, that this could actually come under threat through the mechanisms that you're talking about. So I wanted to ask whether you think that these mechanisms will sort of likely carry over, or will they be more attenuated in Western societies, given sort of explicit commitments to pluralism, whereas in Indonesia and other parts of Asia, you have this more communitarian notion of public space, right? The other question that I had was, you're talking about the visibility of the Ahmadiyya as becoming much more prevalent in 2005. And I was thinking about 2005 when I was actually in Indonesia, and I was studying Christian Muslim violence in central Sulawesi, as well as Maluku and North Maluku, but I was spending more time in central Sulawesi as well as central Java. And one of the things that I noted from some of my field work was there seemed to be quite a bit of fatigue by the population in central Sulawesi of Christian Muslim violence. And actually, I interviewed the head of Laskar Jihad in central Java as well during this time. And he had lost support from the government, who, or at least state actors who sort of had sponsored his forays into central Sulawesi and the Malukus. So I'm wondering if maybe the timing could possibly, as an alternative explanation, be explained by maybe a search for new targets, right? Whereas before, this Christian Muslim cleavage may have been something that resonated enough and state actors sort of tolerated it to a certain degree, but then when it became too much and invited too much criticism from the international community, the state said, okay, we're not going to allow that. And so an easy target are the Shia. The easy target are these micro minorities like the Ahmadiyya, right? So I wonder if maybe that might be an alternative explanation to the decentralization argument that you put forward. And I actually think that there's something to what you're saying, because it does sort of link into these organizations' incentives. And the other thing that I wanted to ask was, you talked about the FPI and their rise during this period. And I think up until that point, many of their activities were sort of shaking down nightclubs and, during Ramadan, for example, right, in Jakarta, right? And, since then, what has been interesting to see and alarming, of course, is that they've sort of spread out to these other issue areas, and they've actually grown in influence. So I'm wondering maybe if you could sort of comment on why that might be the case, because it is certainly, they weren't the only actors out there during the time, right? There was Laskar Jihad, there was MMI, you had various Laskar groups as well. So what is it that sort of allowed them to sort of resonate more and expand? So these are three questions. I'm gonna sort of leave it at that because I don't want to take up much space here, but I want to hear more about what you have to say.
So I'm just following. Can I answer those comments,
Yeah,
Dr.
definitely.
Esposito? Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Yuki, for those comments. And I'm a big fan of your book. For those of you watching, it's a really extraordinary book on violence in Indonesia. So I just want to give a plug for that. So let me sort of walk through these questions because, I've been thinking about these questions. I don't know if I have sort of these answers sort of fully pat, but I can try to sort of speculate on the points. So the question of whether or not I see this, if Indonesia or more communal, communitarian countries are maybe more susceptible to these kinds of things versus the West, which perhaps more values the individual a little bit more. I don't know. So I'm gonna just speculate on this. I still think that even in places where individual rights are respected, can still fall to these kinds of trends and these kinds of aspects, because I do think that even in sort of these individualist or more liberal kind of places, you still have groups playing a paramount role. Maybe it's not religious groups, right? But if we're talking about sort of the US, we can think about sort of racial groups, for example. In Canada, which is where I am right now, language groups, I think, is a very politically salient group. So even I think in these moments, in these places where it might not be religion that's playing the most dominant politically salient role, that these still have that we can still see these challenges to sort of constitutive elements of groupness. And I think public space does play an important role. Think about all of these, protests against sort of Confederate flags, right, is so important, and also Confederate statues. And so we see these kinds of symbolic politics really, really playing a role. And so I think these things are worthy of exploring why they're so important, because in many ways you're kind of like, why does it matter in some ways? But and sometimes I do think that, but I'm starting, obviously through this project, I've started to rethink that. In terms of your alternative explanation about sort of the fatigue about Christian Muslim violence, first of all, I can't believe that you got an interview with the head of Laskar Jihad. That's must have been pretty hard to get, and so that's super interesting. I guess I'm kind of skeptical about the idea that there was fatigue. I definitely think that Christians, the conflict between Christians and Muslims still have resonance in Indonesia. I mean, I think a lot about sort of these fights over like Merry Christmas and wearing Santa hats in Indonesia. So, there was a lot of these hardliner groups have been going around sort of getting upset about people wearing Santa hats and saying Merry Christmas. And so I think that there is something resonant still about those, particularly outside of sort of Maluku and Central Sulawesi, where these conflicts weren't occurring. So I guess in many ways I was thinking that, why build targets from scratch, right? When you know that it's worked before, like, why not try? And I think in many ways that if there was fatigue, the question is, why not other kinds of groups? So why not the ethnic Chinese, I think is the question that I've thought a lot about. That's also a very easy group to kind of mobilize violence against. So I thought it was this new target, I think, what was very confusing to me. And I guess that would be sort of my speculation on that. In terms of the FBI, it's a really interesting, question to see their rise. It's very, for those of you who don't know, the head of the FBI recently came back to Jakarta after 3 years away in Saudi Arabia. And, it was kind of hard to imagine that the group has escalated to this degree. And as Yuki mentioned, they began sort of like these gangs kind of extorting money from nightclubs and things like that. So actually the FBI actually engaged in Ahmadiyya mobilization from a group called the LPPI, and Najib Burhani has kind of written about this, where the LPPI was the group that was kind of organizing in the beginning these anti-Ahmadiyya protests, and then they invited the FBI to join them. And then, from then on, it was kind of history where they led this process. And I think that the Ahmadiyya issue was really what solidified or consolidated who they were, because they became very clearly associated with that movement. And so they were able to kind of sell themselves as these sort of moral vigilantes. And I think they also consolidated their networks, not just within the groups themselves, but with politicians when they were sort of protesting and also pushing them to actually pass a lot of these restrictive laws. And so, I really do see the Ahmadiyya as kind of the stepping stone for that. And so that's kind of my thoughts on that. I really do see this issue as explaining in large part why they are now so powerful. So thank you so much. That's rambly and long, but yeah.
As we head into the Q&A, I just wanted to just raise something with you. It might be interesting sometime, not so much to do an in-depth study, but to look and compare the situation in Indonesia to that in Pakistan. Because in Pakistan, when it was founded as an Islamic state or Islamic republic in 1947-48, you did have the foreign minister was a member of the Ahmadiyya. And you also had a Catholic, by the way, that was the head of the legal side of things. And there was a real reaction to the Ahmadiyya at one point, and that came from very conservative Muslim groups, including the Jamaat-e-Islami, the Islamic group of the Islamic Society. It kind of quieted down, and then when Bhutto came in, when Zulfikar Ali Bhutto came in, and he began to also appeal more to Islam, and certainly under Zia-ul-Haq, you had a flare-up, and so much that Bhutto, who was really a kind of secular socialist in background, went along with the idea of banning the group from being considered a Muslim group. And therefore, they could not use words like mosque, Muslim, salat, or namaz for prayer, very, very strictly. And part of the also irony there, where there can be a little bit more of a wrinkle, is that in general, the Ahmadiyya have often been seen as more modern oriented, a more kind of educated, sort of group, but still seen as non-Muslim. And that continues also in terms of in the West. I mean, whether it's in the US or countries in Europe, where, you'll find more conservative Muslims will still feel that there's an issue for anyone to put, as it were, the Ahmadiyya on, it's not a level playing field to put the Ahmadiyya on an, if you will, an Islam playing field. But anyway, I just thought I would mention that. So we have time for questions and answers, and I'll turn it over to Andrew Condon, who will be handling that.
All right, so we do have a couple of Q&A questions here, and so I'm going to go through them chronologically. The first one is from Stanley Harsha. Stanley Harsha is head of the U.S. Embassy for Democracy Unit and General Counsel. He asks, your decentralization theory is very credible, and this is to Dr. Rodrigo, but national politics are equally important. The MUI fatwa against the Ahmadiyya have caused several reactions, as did SBY's public statements. Some Ahmadiyya were attacked and expelled even when they stayed behind closed doors. Would you care to comment on this?
Yeah. Should I respond, to each question, or do you want to collect?
Yeah.
We have a number of questions. I'd say, yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. Thank you so much for the question. Yeah, it's definitely one of those things where I see kind of it in a two-part sort of process. So let me kind of answer this question in maybe two steps. So the first one is maybe the impact of the MUI fatwa. So this is something that I've thought a lot about, and I've struggled with, because I do think that you are right, like that you're definitely right, that it's an important step that I didn't mention because I was focusing largely at the local level. I would say that in many ways so the MUI fatwa came out after this protest in Parung, the headquarters of the Ahmadiyya, and that was sort of when MUI chose to issue the fatwa. I think MUI issued the fatwa for I think Jacqueline Hicks has a really great article on this where she talks about sort of the incentives that MUI had in passing the fatwa, but that's not your question. The question is on impact. I would say that the MUI fatwa sort of articulated the constitutive threat of the Ahmadiyya, but what is interesting still to me is what immediately happened after that, and I still and I argue that it had a very uneven effect, right? So the opponents of Ahmadiyya communities who sort of took that on and began to mobilize against those communities were in communities where they had these long histories of contention due to sort of space claiming on the part of Ahmadi communities, right? So certainly, and I have a chapter on the MUI fatwa in the book, though I don't really know what to do with it. I definitely think that it was helpful in articulating what the nature of the threat was. But, you don't see these kinds of responses in places where the group wasn't engaged in space claiming. And so I think in many ways it was just another weapon in the toolbox, right? And so national politics plays an important role in clarifying, but then kind of has uneven effects, and these uneven effects are due to kind of these local level factors, as well as sort of the SBY statement as well. In terms of sort of, why do so you eventually maybe see these Ahmadis who kind of stay behind closed doors, but then are still attacked. So I kind of see the process as being in two stages. So the first stage is really where you have sort of these decentralized, the story that I was telling you in the presentation kind of is in operation. But I do see that there is a tipping point, and the tipping point is sort of when eventually the Ahmadiyya are seen as threats all around Indonesia, right? And so I see this kind of happening in 2008, obviously, with the passing of the law. And with this sort of accumulation, this tipping point, then you start seeing sort of attacks against the Ahmadis sort of more broadly, not just those who are engaged in space claiming activities. So I do see that once you hit that tipping point, it's no longer just a story about local politics. But so thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to kind of expand on that.
And we have another question that's related. This is from Haninda Vidyasti. She says, thank you for sharing your research. You mentioned that politicians played the Ahmadiyya issue as a sort of tool to win elections between 2005 and 2013. Did your research touch on whether it was more instrumental and influential for local level elections or for presidential elections? And could you care to address this?
So thank you for that question. So the easy answer is no, I didn't look at the distinctions between local elections and presidential elections. I would say that in some ways, especially sort of during SBY, there was kind of this attempt by the government to kind of play a more sort of like hands-off neutral role. And so you can actually see this in the 2008 national law, where so I talked to one of the policymakers that was in charge of crafting the national law against the Ahmadiyya. There was a national law passed in 2008, and they were very, very careful in terms of sort of trying to play this kind of gray space, right? Where they're not saying, they're like, yeah, you shouldn't, attack them or anything, but yeah, we're going to say that they're blasphemous because they don't fit in these, like, I think it was 14 criteria of what is Muslim orthodoxy. And so, I can't make, so the answer would be no, I'm not sure, but I'm guessing that at the national level, there was really this sort of attempt not to kind of, to make sure that the discriminatory law could pass sort of the constitutional court. And they were kind of trying to deal with what was going on. And And so, yeah, I think that there's a lot more different calculations that you have to make at the national level, I think with managing minorities and things like that. But at the local level, I definitely think it was instrumental. So I'm not sure if that's the most satisfactory answer, but that's kind of what I have right now. Thank you.
So another question we have is from Ifat Mirza. Great talk. I was just wondering if you had any comments on the presence of the Ahmadiyya community in the virtual space, with TV station, MTA, official channels, Ahmadiyya presence on social media or international press. How has their presence in this space heightened any potential violence against the community?
Yeah. So thank you, Eva. This is the question that has prompted a lot of reflection on my part because the virtual space, I think, acts in such a different way. So in many ways, like the visibility of the Ahmadi communities became sort of more clear in the national consciousness because of social media. So that one of the pictures that I showed of the Chikistik violence, and that was probably, like, I tried not to make it graphic, but they had, really graphic videos that were kind of spread through YouTube and things like that. And that was really that went viral, right? And so I think your instincts are definitely right that the virtual space is something that is important. I guess it's unclear to me how much the perpetrators, so groups like the FPI, were actually watching a lot of or accessing a lot of these Ahmadi sort of social media. It doesn't seem that they were. They seem to be sort of more prompted by sort of presence in like the physical world, the physical public space, because that was what they would refer to during interviews. And so there would be that, I think. So I didn't really see that the Ahmadi's presence as being sort of really central to the story in Indonesia. More the virtual stuff is more so from the sort of perpetrator side. But yeah, I think that's definitely something to look into, and it's a whole new world out there, I guess, with social media. So yeah, I definitely need to think about that for the book, for sure. It's a question that comes up all the time. So thank you so much for identifying that.
Okay, we have a couple more. I'm trying to get to as many as we can. We have another question here from Dr. Tamara Sun, ACMCU's own Dr. Tamara Sun, who says, very interesting. Do you think your findings are applicable to other countries, for example, Pakistan?
So my answer would be, I hope so. I think we have to think about sort of generalizability for sure. By Pakistan, I'm guessing you mean Dr. Esposito's comment about sort of thinking about sort of how the Ahmadiyya community there operated. I think so in the book project, I see so I called Ahmadis and Shia micro-sized groups because they're less than 1% of the national population. And so the whole book is really trying to understand why these groups are seen as threatening. In the Pakistan case, Ahmadis, I don't think are micro-sized groups. I think they're a bit larger as part of the national population. So in many ways, I think it's about disentangling what it is about these groups that are larger. Like, what is it that's threatening about these sort of larger groups when you start bringing in sort of economic aspects, political aspects, in the case of the Ahmadis in Pakistan, like not security aspects. But I think it's about disentangling them. And so I think that you have different kinds of threat coming from when you have a bigger minority group, right? But in many ways, I think you can think about sort of constitutive threats more generally, though often when it's a larger group, you do have other sort of things going on, like economic threat as well. And the Ahmadiyya case in the Pakistan case is so interesting because, as Dr. Esposito had mentioned, there was sort of this effort to clearly place the Ahmadiyya outside of Islam, right? So they can no longer call themselves as Muslims. And I had, and so while I'm not an expert in Pakistan, it seems that the constitutive threat of the Ahmadis in the Pakistan case was sort of addressed by clearly demarcating these boundaries, right? So I had a conversation with someone who studies the Ahmadis, Mizba Hyrer I feel like I messed up her last name, but she's she does really interesting work on the Ahmadis. She's a grad student at UC Irvine, and she we were talking through this, and it seems that the demarcation of boundaries really did sort of diffuse the conflict, because the existential constitutive threat was diffused, and so, or diffused. Diffuse is the right word. And so I think there are elements that can be generalizable, but I would be hesitant to generalize outside of these very, very small groups. So thank you so much for that question.
Okay, we have another question here. This is from a Matthew McCandles. It says, great presentation here at Georgetown. Thank you so much. Curious if you have thoughts about the relative importance of religious confidence among a majority community for this type of communal-based violence. For example, if a significant portion of a religious minority, for whatever such reasons, are becoming uncertain about their identity during a period of time, would the opportunity for religious entrepreneurship using identity conflict and actual conflict be potentially greater as a result?
Yeah. So thank you so much, Matthew, for that very insightful comment. And this is something that I've thought about a lot, whether it's because, Muslims at a particular time in Indonesia, where there was uncertainty about their position, their dominance, is it about that? I think that's a possibility that I'm still working through. I think I would say that certain kinds of religions, depending on their religious authority, are more sort of susceptible to these kinds of constitutive threats than others. So in religious groups or religious sects like Sunnism or Protestantism, where religious authority is more decentralized and there's a lot more uncertainty about sort of what makes a person a Sunni Muslim, what makes a person sort of a Protestant Christian. When there's, I think, these sort of decentralized significant diversity in these groups, I think these groups are particularly susceptible to these kinds of threats. Though, I'm still really working through this timing question for sure. I think that's an important part of the story. I just haven't really thought through that logic yet.
Let's see, we have a couple of related questions here. We have one from Mizba Hyder. They say, you mentioned that the Ahmadiyya are not sociopolitically or socioeconomically privileged, particularly in Indonesia. They say this is interesting because, as they see it, the community has been considered privileged in South Asia. What are the connections between the Indonesian community with institutions? Since this community is highly institutionalized, do they have access to leverage more so than perhaps Shia communities?
So I'm so glad to hear that Mizba is here, because I just mentioned her, and she does really wonderful work, I have to say. So yeah, I guess it's really interesting to think comparatively. Yeah, the Ahmadis in Indonesia, I think, are very, as she mentioned, very well organized. So it's a very pyramidal kind of organization where you have the center office in Bogor, and then they all have connections, and it's very well organized, the network. I don't know if they have more leverage. I guess I just don't really see. So from what I've encountered, I feel like the Ahmadis haven't been able to get hardly any leverage at all, even due to their size. So maybe the institutionalization of the organization certainly helps them, but in some ways I think it has made it somewhat difficult. In many ways, is the fact that they do have this very centralized body that kind of clearly establishes new branches, very frequently sort of makes there's more opportunities to actually amplify, right? Like, so in the Shia community, there's only maybe like 4 or 5 institutions, and so you don't have these opportunities to amplify. But because of in the Ahmadis, you have like branches being established, even if there's only like 10 people in a village, you do have more of these opportunities for these hardliner groups to attack. So I don't know if it's maybe not exactly your question, but it's related to that in terms of, you prompted thinking on in terms of organization and how the organizations change anything. But yeah, I haven't really seen a big impact in terms of institutionalization as sort of giving them leverage to kind of protect themselves. Unfortunately, I think in some ways that's actually had the opposite effect.
Okay, we have a question from a Mohandarshki Ladri. Asks, did conflicts based on religious or religion result to group categories regarding level of belief, such as primordialism, instrumentalism, or idealism? Do you see anything there?
Sorry, I think you cut off, but let me So maybe to clarify this question, so I'm just gonna look at it because I don't really, I kind of missed the core of it. Sorry, is there a way to kind of see
I can phrase it again. Yeah, it's in the answered category.
Oh,
so
okay.
I can read it verbatim.
Yeah.
Did conflicts based on religion result to group categories regarding their religion level of belief, such as primordialists, instrumentalists, and idealists?
Yeah. So to be honest, I don't know if I can answer this question because I feel I don't want to sort of speculate on people's sort of level of religious beliefs. I think that there were people who very much disagreed with what the FPI was doing. And I would, think that they were also quite pious. Maybe another way to frame your question is, how, like, where on the spectrum they were in terms of their beliefs about pluralism and the degree of pluralism. How do you kind of navigate sort of differences in terms of Muslims who actually, agree or disagree or don't see the Ahmadis as necessarily a constitutive threat? They're like, that's not a really important question. I think this is where visibility, I think, plays a role. So we always have kind of, a wide range of people who have different beliefs about, the limits of group boundaries. Some have very expansive views of who can belong. Others have very narrow views, if you can belong. And so what you have, I think, is visibility playing a role in the middle, right? It strengthens or makes the wide middle kind of nervous and makes them aware. And so it's for those people so it's how visibility contracts, makes sort of this sense of group boundaries more contract. So I don't think contracted maybe is the right term. So I don't think it's necessarily degree of religious belief or piety, but sort of ideas about pluralism and where that kind of fits in.
Okay, so we have, let's see here. We have Noma Nabi says, thank you for your presentation. You mentioned Shias a little bit less. They're apologizing, they tuned in a little bit later. And they're wondering if certain sects like Ismailis are less likely to be targeted. Is it plausible that Shias would get more attention than Ahmadiyas, even though Shias are considered more or less, I guess, mainstream?
Yeah, I think so I can't answer the Ismaili question because I don't really study that group. I'm just gonna. I realize I'm a visual learner, so I'm doing a very bad job kind of retaining the questions in my mind. So I would say that, like I was saying at the end of the presentation, Shia, I think, weren't getting as much attention as the Ahmadiyas. I think it's definitely, in many other cases, they're much more, Shias are much more politically salient. But in the case of Indonesia, and I'm arguing that it's because of levels of visibility. What is interesting and maybe I think has challenged me in my comparison is that that there's a lot more disagreement about whether Shias sort of belong in the fold of Islam. So Ahmadiyas, I think there is a broader consensus that they're a heterodox group, but I think there's a lot more disagreement about whether or not Shias actually are a constitutive threat, to the boundaries of group. So, I think that's something that's really forcing me to think about sort of visibility and the importance of that. And so that is still an open question in my book project, which I need to work on for sure.
Okay, we have a question here from Stanley Harsha. Stanley says, I've read that Jacoby's efforts to promote more tolerance against religious minorities has made the climate better for the Ahmadiyya. Do you think this is the case?
I don't really think that it's necessarily Jokowi. Maybe I think that there if you don't have someone who's more who's maybe a little bit more pluralist, I think that does matter. But it seems to me that a lot of the Ahmadis, like the trends of conflict, was declining before 2014. And so I think definitely his position could help, but I'm not sure if it's, playing the decisive role in kind of this decline against the Ahmadis.
Okay, let's see, we have a couple more. So this is one is from Faisal Baure. Just wondering, what is the theological difference between the Ahmadiyya and mainstream Islam? Do you see if this difference can be bridged? More of a general question.
Yeah, so like I mentioned in the discussion, the main issue with theological difference is because they believe that their founder, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, is a prophet, and that sort of and Muhammad is not the last prophet. It's a much more nuanced actually position than that, but that's kind of sort of the main point. Can the difference be bridged? I think this is where the group boundary work has to be done, where you have sort of an expansion of, if the belief that Muhammad is not the final prophet, no longer becomes seen as this core foundation of Islam, then I think that difference can be bridged. But I'm not sure, because I think it's a pretty sort of central goal. I think what might be possible is, instead of to reframe concepts of what it means to be, maybe it's not necessarily about Islam, but what it means to be Indonesian. I think this is what kind of Ahmadis have been doing in Indonesia, instead of trying to showcase that they're, trying to address this idea that they're like a constitutive threat to Islam. They don't use those words, but it's kind of how I've interpreted it. They've tried to emphasize their citizenship as Indonesians, and that Indonesia is a pluralist conception of nationhood. And so they're trying to reframe themselves as members of the Indonesian nation, not necessarily. And so they're kind of not, so that's kind of how I think that the bridging might take place.
All right, we have about two more at present, though keep coming in. So this is from Mohammed Afdia. Hi, Jessica. Thank you for your presentation. It's good to hear from you. I have two questions. One, does your research cover the different patterns of violence against minority groups within Java and outside of Java? And number two, how do the local governments respond in terms of regulation to the violence? Thank you.
Yeah. So Mohammed Abdullah helped me so much during the field, and so I owe such a great debt to him. So thank you so much for coming. And his work on Shias in Indonesia is just really, really wonderful. So in case you want to learn more about the Shia. So my work mostly focuses on Java. I think that's a big question for a lot of people who study Indonesia. But I do look at North Sumatra, and people were like, that's a really weird case. Like, why would you choose North Sumatra? But what I found about North Sumatra was levels of anti-Ahmadiyya conflict in North Sumatra were actually quite high during the authoritarian period. They actually had a lot of court cases going on against the Ahmadis during the Suharto era, which is kind of why I wanted to understand like why it was no longer seen as a problem. So that's kind of the simple answer to that. I do look at Sumatra. I do think that a lot of the conflict has happened mostly in Java, and I think those are maybe due to patterns of settlement. Outside of Java, the Ahmadis have mostly been in, like I said, North Sumatra, and I think very much less visible than a lot of the communities in Java. I'm still trying to figure out why. So that's kind of an answer or a non-answer to your question. In terms of how do local governments respond in terms of regulations to violence, I think that varies. So the one sort of positive response in terms of regulation is in the Bandung case, which is where the police actually actively began to try to protect the Ahmadi communities, though they basically told them, you have to put up blue tarps and you can't like leave your mosque, is their response. But otherwise, I think the response is just to kind of police a lot more and kind of side more with the perpetrators, or, turn a blind eye. That's kind of the response that I've been seeing.
Okay, looks like we do have a related question. So this is from Alexander Peltier. Fascinating talk, thank you so much. Is the choice of targets, Christian, Ahmadiyya, Shia, Javanese, related to the presence or absence of allies in the local bureaucracies? So do Ahmadiyya and other micro-sized groups have members in police forces, local governments, courts? Does that make a difference at all?
Thanks, Alex. I always can depend on you for asking very thought-provoking and difficult questions. Yeah. So it seems to me that they don't really, from my knowledge, they don't have a lot of Ahmadis don't really have a lot of representation in the police force. I have heard stories where they have been members of the bureaucracy, though often they do kind of face a glass ceiling of some kind where, once they're found out as Ahmadis, they don't actually, get promoted and they're kind of pushed out. And so that's the sort of factual answer. In terms of whether that would make a difference, I think what might make a difference is that you might see a lot more sort of active protection, I think, from the government. So far, the state has tended to be very non-responsive. The police has tended to kind of not actively protect a lot of these groups. So I think that might be where it is. And maybe you would see sort of these less sort of aggressive draconian laws, but I guess I'm not particularly optimistic with a lot of these sort of smaller groups just because of their inability to get representation. But maybe for the Christians, I think there's definitely a lot of more room to kind of speculate on that for sure.
Okay, and we have one final question here. This is from Sahar Banu. It's a bit long, so I'm going to read it, but I'll leave it in the chat if you want to reread it. So it says, Sahar Banu from NGO Contras, the Commission for the Disappearance of Victims of Violence in Indonesia. After we understand how the persecution to religious minorities case escalated, we need to step in another level, advocacy and campaign to stop the violence toward minorities. The question is, one, can you give us some advice about how to deliver advocacy strategy to make government protect the minority or to punish the government and police institutions who fail to protect minorities. You know, one of anti-Ahmadiyya movements is escalated after SKB3 Metri number 3, 2008. It was like the government gave legal order to persecute the Ahmadiyya community. And number 2, do you have suggestions about campaign strategy in intolerance cases when most people or mobs who attack the minority reject the concept of human rights and basic of humanity? As part of civil society organization, to be honest, would you like to respond? Do you have an idea?
Yeah. So I just want to say thank you, Banu, for being here. Banu is actually one of my research assistants and you know, has done such a wonderful job sort of helping me understand this topic. I think that's a really big question, right? Like how to kind of make things better for these minorities, especially when they're so small and just don't have a lot of political power. I would say that the major implication of my work is that the Ahmadis and then to some degree the Shia are seen as sort of threats, existential threats to the Muslim category. And I think the way that a lot of people the Ahmadis are doing now, this idea of reframing these group boundaries and it perhaps reframing themselves as members of the Indonesian nation. I think that is probably where a lot of the work can be done in terms of making Ahmadis and Shia, you know, no longer seem as threatening to this category of Muslim by saying like, you know, we belong to another group that you're also a part of, and that is, you know, the Indonesian nation. So I think that is probably the most immediate strategy or implication of my work. In terms of sort of more concrete policies, in terms of, you know, reforming the police, reforming the courts, I think there's always hope in that. But I guess maybe I'm just now jaded where I'm like, you know, how much reform can actually be done to the state. But yeah, I'm not super optimistic about the short term, what can be done to kind of pressure these organizations into kind of being more for human rights. But yeah, we should talk about it like later as like privately for sure.
Okay, I think that we've taken all of the questions that we've had. As we move towards closing, I thought that I would just note for the participants that very often when we talk about the kind of topic we have today, we're talking about pluralism in a country like Indonesia or pluralism country X or Y and the treatment of minorities like the Ahmadiyya. And sometimes when we do that in the West, in the United States and Europe, we do it as if we're looking to something that's a situation that's very underdeveloped and peculiar and not something that fits within our pluralistic vision of ourselves. But one of the things I would point out is that what we have had in recent years is an incredible increase, both in the United States and in Europe, of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, which one needs to think about within our pluralist society. And we do have a situation in the United States where the president of the country has said Islam hates us and put a Muslim ban in place. And I think that if you look at the US situation, if you look at the situation in France also, the challenge of how do you distinguish between a situation that you have with a small group of people within a religious group from how you then respond to that broader religious group, becomes very significant. So it's not as if we can say that in many ways that at the present moment we are light years ahead. Some would argue that we're going backwards. I want to thank Jessica. This is a terrific program. I mean, you can see really, your presentation was excellent and you stimulated a lot of questions and you handled it really well. And I also like to thank Yuki for your questions and also your reference to to kind of bringing up also the Western context with this issue. I would mention for those that are on that you'll be receiving invitations to a program next week that will be dealing with Southeast Asia, and the following week that will be dealing with the racialization of Muslims in the United States. So stay tuned, and we look forward to seeing all of you in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone.